The line for the TSA checkpoint stretched farther than usual, voices mixing with the steady shuffle of luggage wheels. Somewhere near the front, a sharp voice cut through the low murmur of the crowd. "Priority lanes for premium passengers only," the officer said, his gaze fixed on me with a kind of skepticism I knew all too well. His badge caught the light, but it was his tone that drew the stares. I handed over my boarding pass without a word. He scanned it, eyes narrowing, then looked back at me like he was waiting for an explanation I hadn't been asked to give. "Where'd you get this ticket?" he asked, his voice pitched just loud enough for the people behind me to hear. I'd heard that question before. Never for the white businessman in line ahead of me, never for the family with matching luggage behind me. But for me, somehow, it was necessary. "It's mine," I said evenly. "Paid for. Confirmed. First class." The corners of his mouth pulled tight. "First class?" He glanced past me to the couple behind, who were now leaning forward, clearly entertained. The air in the line shifted, not because of the security process, but because everyone sensed what was coming. My palms pressed against the handle of my carry-on. I'd learned to spot these moments, the ones where a simple trip could turn into an ordeal. "Step aside," he ordered. "Is there a problem?" I asked, still in place. He took a half step closer. "Step aside." The passengers behind me shuffled awkwardly to make room, their eyes following me like I was part of an unexpected airport performance. I moved to the spot he indicated, my boarding pass still in his hand. "What exactly are you questioning here?" I said, keeping my voice calm. "Whether you belong in that line," he answered, slow and deliberate. A ripple moved through the queue, not laughter, not outrage, just a subtle wave of curiosity and judgment, all rolled into one. My chest felt tight, but I held my posture. I had nothing to prove to him. Yet here I was, defending my right to walk through the same lane others passed without a second glance. The officer's eyes swept over me once more, then a faint smirk appeared. He leaned in just enough that the words were meant for me, but the volume was for the crowd. And when he spoke, the entire line went silent. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. And if you believe respect should never depend on skin color, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a story like this one. I've spent most of my adult life in rooms where introductions are more than just a name. They're a statement of credibility. Law school trained me for that. The courtroom refined it, and years of running a nonprofit that pushes for fair treatment in travel and hospitality have made it second nature. I've been on enough planes to lose count. Conferences, legal summits, humanitarian meetings. My passport is thick with stamps, but my patience for injustice is thin. The irony is, I've dedicated years to making the travel experience fairer for everyone, yet I still brace myself every time I step into an airport. Flying first class isn't about luxury for me. It's about practicality. I'm constantly on the move, and direct flights with more flexible seating give me the time and space I need to work. My ticket that day was booked weeks in advance, same as always. But in the eyes of some, that seat, that lane, wasn't meant for someone like me. I didn't mention my husband to the officer at the checkpoint, and I didn't need to. To me, my seat was earned. But my husband? Let's just say he knows the airline industry better than most, the kind of better that comes from sitting at the very top. Still, I've never relied on his name to command respect. I've always wanted to stand on my own credentials. This wasn't my first run-in with quiet discrimination at an airport. I remember a trip to Chicago years ago when a gate agent looked at my boarding pass, then at me, and asked if I was sure I was in the right boarding group. I remember the business trip to Toronto, where security swabbed every item in my carry-on while letting the man ahead of me walk through with his laptop still in his bag. Those moments sting, but they don't always make headlines. They're the invisible weight you carry, the ones that make you over-prepare for something as simple as walking to your seat. For some, it's paranoia. For me, it's pattern recognition. When you've lived through enough of these encounters, you develop a quiet set of defenses. You speak with measured tones, so no one can accuse you of being emotional. You keep your receipts and confirmation numbers ready before they're even asked for. You make sure your documents are perfectly aligned in your passport sleeve, so no one can claim you're unprepared. That morning, I thought I was ready for anything, but there's a difference between readiness and immunity. No resume, no ticket, no miles logged can protect you when someone's decided, before you've even said a word, that you don't belong where you're standing. And in that security line, under the sharp eyes of that officer, I realized this wasn't going to be one of those quick, forgettable moments. It was going to be one of those moments you remember for years. The officer still had my boarding pass in his hand, turning it over like he was looking for something that wasn't there. "I'm going to need to see a second form of ID," he said, drawing out each word as if I might not understand him otherwise. I slid my driver's license across the podium without comment. He barely glanced at it before saying, "Do you have anything else? Passport? Work ID?" I frowned. "The license and boarding pass are all that's required," he shrugged, tapping the pass against the podium. "Humor me." My carry-on was wedged between my legs to keep the line moving behind me, but I unzipped it and pulled out my passport. He took it slowly, his eyes skimming the page as if the photograph might suddenly morph into someone else's face. "Why are you flying today?" he asked, still in that stretched, deliberate tone. "I have a business meeting," I said. "Business?" His eyes flicked from my face to the crowd behind me. "What kind of business?" I could feel the weight of the stares now, not just curiosity but interest in a spectacle. People weren't looking away, and the officer seemed to like it that way. "I'm the director of a nonprofit," I answered. His brow lifted slightly. "Traveling alone?" "Yes." He leaned on the podium. "Where's your meeting? Atlanta? What's the address?" The question caught me off guard. "The address?" "Yes, the address." "Where are you going when you land?" I gave him the address. He typed it into his computer with unnecessary slowness, each keystroke like a punctuation mark in a conversation I didn't want to be having. As this dragged on, I noticed the woman 2 spots ahead of me, same priority lane, same type of ticket, had walked straight through without more than a quick glance at her ID. The man behind her was already gathering his things from the conveyor belt. I stepped forward, thinking maybe it was finally over, but his hand came up like a stop sign. "Not so fast, I'm flagging you for additional screening." I stared at him. "Based on what?" His lips curved just slightly. "Random selection." Except it wasn't random, not when I'd been selected before. Not when I could count how many times in the last year alone I'd been pulled aside while others passed untouched. "This way," he said, pointing toward a roped-off area. My steps felt heavier as I moved past the line, pulling my carry-on behind me. A young couple leaned toward each other, whispering. One man shook his head as if he already knew the story without hearing a single word of it. I was told to remove my shoes and place every item from my bag into separate bins. Each piece was swabbed, scanned, then swabbed again. The officer hovered nearby, pretending to monitor but never taking his eyes off me. Another agent, clearly less invested in the show, ran my bag through the scanner. "You're good," she said flatly. But the officer who'd started this didn't look satisfied. "Ma'am," he said, "you can go for now. For now." The words were meant to linger, and they did. Not because I feared the next step, but because I knew exactly what this was, the kind of power play designed to remind you where he thought you belonged. And right then, he had no idea that the very next move I made would shift the entire balance of that power. I'd barely cleared the additional screening area when his voice cut through the noise again, louder this time. "Ma'am," he called, "I'm not done with you." Every head within earshot turned. The metal detectors beeped as other passengers went through, but their attention was fixed on me. I walked back, my bag in hand. "What now?" His tone sharpened. "You're being combative." I blinked. "I'm asking what the problem is." "That's exactly what I mean," he said, raising his voice so the crowd could hear. "You're questioning standard security procedures." The people in line shifted, some whispering to each other. I could feel the spotlight without a stage, the weight of dozens of eyes pulling at my dignity. "Remove your shoes again," he said. "They were just screened," I replied, my voice steady. "Remove them," he snapped. I stepped out of them slowly, placing them in the gray bin he shoved forward. "Unpack your bag completely," he added. The bin for my carry-on was already crowded with my laptop, chargers, a file folder of documents, and a small case with personal items. I hesitated. "Everything," he barked. "All of it out where we can see it." I unzipped the front pouch, pulling out a scarf, a pair of reading glasses, and a travel-sized container of lotion. Then the main compartment, my clothes folded neatly, the jacket I'd planned to wear for my meeting, a gift I'd wrapped for a colleague's retirement. Piece by piece, my belongings went on display. The silence behind me was broken by a small voice. "Mom, why is that lady in trouble?" I didn't turn around, but I heard the mother's hushed reply, the kind meant to deflect a child's curiosity without explaining too much. I wondered what story she'd tell later. My throat tightened. I'd been in this airport dozens of times. I'd walked through this checkpoint without a second glance from anyone, when the ticket, the clothing, or the mood of the officer seemed to make me less of a target. But today, none of that mattered. Today, I wasn't a traveler, I was a suspect. He leaned over the bins, inspecting my things like they were evidence. "Traveling for business, huh?" he said, drawing out the word business as if it were a joke only he understood. "Yes," I answered. "Looks more like a vacation to me," he muttered, not even pretending to lower his voice. Heat spread up my neck, the kind that comes from being wrongfully accused yet knowing any protest will be twisted into confirmation of guilt. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I stood there, hands by my sides, forcing my breathing into a slow, steady rhythm. I wasn't going to shrink. Not here. Not for him. After what felt like an eternity, he straightened up, glanced at the other officer nearby, and said, "She can go." The relief in my chest was laced with something sharper. The knowledge that he'd gotten exactly what he wanted. A public scene, a performance that left me exposed while he walked away looking like the authority who'd handled a problem. I gathered my things, placing each item back into my bag with deliberate care, not rushing for his benefit. Shoes back on, bag zipped, I stepped away from the checkpoint. But I didn't get far before I realized something. He might have ended the scene, but the story was far from over. I'd almost reached the end of the concourse when the voice came again. Not loud enough to call me back officially, but just enough for me to hear every word. "People like you think you can buy your way through security." The words stopped me mid-step. I turned slowly, not because I wanted to, but because every muscle in my body told me this was the moment. He wasn't even looking at me when he said it, busy checking the ID of the man behind me. But the smirk was still there, the same one from the start, the one that told me he thought he'd won something here. For a second, I weighed the familiar options. Walk away and let him think he'd made his point, or stand my ground, knowing it would escalate. I walked back. The line shifted again, whispers running ahead of me like a current. He glanced up, clearly surprised I'd returned, but his face didn't change. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" he asked, the fake politeness barely covering the mockery. I stepped close enough that I didn't have to raise my voice. "Yes, there is." He tilted his head, pretending to listen. "I think you'll want to speak to my husband," I said evenly. The smirk widened. "And why would I want to do that?" I reached into my bag, pulling out my phone. "Because in about 30 seconds, you're gonna wish you had." He gave a short laugh, the kind meant to dismiss me. "Go ahead, call whoever you need. I've got nothing to hide." That was fine, because I wasn't calling to argue, I was calling to end this. My thumb found the number on instinct. 1 ring. 2. On the third, a voice answered. Warm for me, sharp the moment I said, "I'm at the airport, being held up by an officer at the TSA checkpoint." The officer's face changed just slightly, a flicker of curiosity behind his eyes as I extended the phone toward him. "He'd like to speak with you," I said. He hesitated, and that hesitation was all I needed to know the balance had shifted. The crowd didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it. Something in the air had moved. Finally, he took the phone. "Yes?" The pause that followed was long enough for me to see it. The smirk fading, his posture stiffening, his eyes darting toward the end of the terminal. Whatever my husband was saying, it wasn't small talk. When the officer handed the phone back, the confidence was gone. "Someone will be here shortly to assist you," he said, his voice low now. I slipped the phone into my bag. "Good," I replied. "I'll wait." And this time it wasn't me standing under the spotlight. It was him. I stood exactly where I was, bag at my feet, the phone call still echoing in my ears. The officer avoided looking directly at me now, pretending to check IDs for the next passengers. But I could see it, the way his jaw worked, the way his stance had gone rigid. Less than 2 minutes later, a man in a dark suit appeared from the far end of the terminal. He was moving fast, not the kind of fast that came from running late, but the kind that came from knowing the situation was urgent. Behind him, 2 others in matching security jackets kept pace. The officer who had stopped me straightened, trying to look busy. But the suited man didn't even glance at the passengers in line. His eyes locked on me first, then flicked to the officer. "You're Officer Reynolds?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the officer replied, voice tight. The man didn't shake his hand, didn't offer a greeting. "Step over here, now." Passengers were openly staring now, their boarding passes forgotten. I could feel the current of curiosity run through the crowd. This wasn't the quiet hum of normal airport life. This was the charged silence before something cracks open. The officer shot me one quick glance before following the man toward the side of the checkpoint. The 2 security staff trailed behind. I stayed where I was, watching them disappear behind a frosted glass door. A few moments later, one of the security staff returned. "Ma'am, please come with me." We bypassed the rest of the checkpoint entirely, stepping through a side gate that led into a quieter corridor. My bag stayed with me. No searches, no extra questions. The corridor opened into a private lounge, the kind usually reserved for airline executives and high-profile passengers. The air felt different here, not because of luxury, but because everyone who worked inside seemed to know exactly who I was now. "Would you like some water?" a woman at the reception desk asked gently. I sat in one of the deep chairs and shook my head. "I'd like to know what's going on." She hesitated, then leaned forward. "Your husband is on the line with the airport director right now." I nodded slowly, the pieces clicking into place. He wasn't just a man who knew the airline industry. He was the man who oversaw the very contracts that kept this airport's premium services running. A fact the officer had no idea about when he decided to make an example out of me. The lounge door opened again. Officer Reynolds walked in, no longer puffed up with authority. His eyes were fixed on the floor. Behind him came the man in the suit, who addressed me directly. "Ma'am, on behalf of the airport and our airline partners, I'd like to apologize for your experience today. The behavior you encountered was unacceptable and will be addressed immediately." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. I met the suited man's gaze. An apology doesn't erase what happened in front of that line of passengers. His nod was measured. "Understood. We're reviewing the security protocols and Officer Reynolds has been placed on immediate leave while the investigation is completed." The officer flinched at the word leave. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat, but I also didn't let them mistake my silence for forgiveness. Because the truth was, this wasn't about me alone. It never had been. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story that exposes the truth when it matters most. Drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this community reaches. The lounge was quiet except for the muted hum of an espresso machine in the corner. I sat there, watching how quickly the atmosphere had shifted from confrontation to cautious accommodation. A few hours ago, I'd been treated like I was trying to slip into a place I didn't belong. Now, every staff member who passed me in the lounge offered a polite nod or asked if there was anything they could bring. It wasn't kindness. It was recognition. The man in the suit returned after a short phone call, his tone now calculated to be deferential. "Your husband has been fully briefed on what occurred," he said. "We're making immediate arrangements for you to be escorted to your gate without further delay." I looked at him steadily. Escorted or watched? He hesitated, then offered the faintest smile. Escorted, with priority boarding, of course. The irony wasn't lost on me. A half hour earlier, I'd been questioned for standing in the very line they were now bending over backwards to place me in. And not because they'd suddenly decided I belonged there, but because they now understood who I was connected to. The suited man gestured toward the door. "If you'll follow me." We walked back through the restricted corridor, bypassing the regular security lines entirely. Staff stepped aside as we passed, their eyes flicking between my face and the man leading me. The same checkpoint that had been a wall an hour ago was now a wide-open doorway. When we reached the gate, The airline's ground manager was waiting. She smiled nervously, her hands clasped in front of her. "We've arranged for you to board first, and the flight crew has been informed to make sure you're comfortable." Her voice was polite, but it carried the same undertone I'd been hearing since the lounge. An unspoken acknowledgement that they'd misjudged me, and that misjudgment had cost them more than they realized. I thanked her, but my eyes were on the officer in the distance. He was standing near another security station, his expression unreadable, though I could tell he was aware of every movement I made. I boarded the plane without incident, my seat waiting in first class as it always had been. The difference was in the faces I passed, some avoiding my eyes entirely, others watching me like they were trying to reconcile what they'd just seen with what they'd assumed earlier. Sliding into my seat, I exhaled slowly. This wasn't over. The public humiliation couldn't be undone with a lounge pass and an apology. But now the balance of power had shifted, and for the first time since stepping into that airport, I could feel the ground tilt in my favor. The question now wasn't whether justice would be served, it was how far my husband and the airline would take it. The plane hadn't even started boarding the rest of the passengers when my phone buzzed. It was my husband. "I've just finished speaking with the airport director," he said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the controlled edge beneath it, the kind of tone that meant decisions were already in motion. "What did you tell him?" I asked. I reminded him exactly who negotiates their premium service contracts and who can end them. I leaned back in my seat, processing his words. I'd always known he had influence in the airline world, but I'd never had to see it in action. He wasn't just a shareholder. He was the principal stakeholder behind a network of agreements that made or broke airport operations across multiple states. The irony was bitter. The officer had been so determined to make me feel like I didn't belong, and yet I was married to the man who signed the papers that determined what belonging even looked like in these terminals. "I didn't want to drag you into this," I admitted quietly. "This isn't just about you," he replied. "It's about every person who gets treated like that and doesn't have the ability to make a call that changes the room." His words landed hard, because he was right. And it's exactly why this story couldn't end with me simply being escorted to my seat and flown to my meeting. Through the crack in the curtain separating first class from the boarding area, I caught sight of the airport's ground operations manager speaking urgently to the gate staff. She was holding a notepad, jotting down instructions as if her job depended on getting every detail right. A flight attendant approached my seat. "The captain sends his regards, ma'am. He's been informed of the situation and has assured me you'll have everything you need during the flight." I thanked her, but part of me felt the weight of what that meant and what it said about how the world works. The same crew who might have walked past me without notice an hour ago now viewed me through an entirely different lens. Not because I had changed, but because my proximity to power had been revealed. I thought about that officer back at the checkpoint. How quick he'd been to challenge my right to stand in a priority line, to demand more proof than the man ahead of me, to turn his voice into a weapon in front of a crowd. And I thought about how quickly the script flipped the moment he realized whose wife he was speaking to. That's the part that sat uneasily with me. Because yes, my situation had shifted. Yes, I was now being treated with exaggerated courtesy. But nothing in their behavior convinced me they'd learned the right lesson. Respect shouldn't come as a perk of knowing the right person. The boarding area beyond the curtain grew louder as the rest of the passengers filed in. I stayed still, my thoughts sharper than ever. This wasn't just going to be a story I told my friends over dinner. This was going to be a case study in exactly how bias operates and how quickly people will cover it when they think their jobs are on the line. And I knew my husband. This wouldn't be the last time the airport director would hear from him. By the time the plane landed in Atlanta, my phone was already filling with messages. My husband had sent me a short update. "The officer has been suspended. Media will call." It wasn't a question, it was a warning. While I gathered my things from the overhead bin, the flight attendant handed me a folded note. "From the captain," she said. Inside, in neat block letters, were 3 words. "We're sorry, ma'am." An apology, yes, but one written on the kind of paper that gets tucked away in a desk and forgotten. I had no intention of letting this disappear. At the terminal exit, a man in an airport badge and navy blazer was waiting for me. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "I've been assigned to accompany you to your car service." I nodded, following him through a quieter hallway. "Tell me something," I said as we walked. "What happens to passengers who get treated like I was but don't have the leverage I have?" He kept his gaze forward. "Most of them. Nothing changes for them." Exactly what I expected, and exactly why this couldn't stay behind closed doors. That afternoon, a statement from the airport authority hit the press. "We take allegations of discriminatory behavior seriously and have placed the involved officer on administrative leave pending investigation." The language was careful, but the subtext was clear. They were already protecting themselves from a PR disaster. Then the calls started. A local news station wanted to interview me about a reported security incident involving a first-class passenger. A travel rights organization I'd worked with in the past emailed, offering to help push for systemic reforms if I wanted to go public. By the end of the week, the officer's name was circulating in internal memos. My husband confirmed that his suspension was without pay. "They're nervous," he told me, "and they should be." But for me, this wasn't about one man's career. It was about the structure that allowed him to look at me, my ticket, my ID, and still decide I didn't belong, and to do it so openly that a child in line thought I was in trouble. The messages I was getting from strangers online were the clearest sign of all. This happened to me last month in Dallas. They pulled me aside in Boston. Same excuse, random screening. I'm a platinum flyer. They still questioned me in front of my kids. Different airports, same pattern, same quiet humiliation. And now, people were paying attention. My husband's team began drafting new contractual clauses for the airline's security partners, ones that required anti-bias training, passenger rights notices at checkpoints, and an independent review process for complaints. The airport director signed off without protest. They weren't in a position to refuse. The incident at that TSA line had started as one man's display of authority. Now, it was about to become the blueprint for stripping that authority of the power to discriminate unchecked. And I wasn't about to slow down. On the flight back home a few days later, I stared out the window, watching the runway lights fade into a trail of gold and white. The noise of the cabin was distant in my ears. My mind kept circling the same thought. This happened to me with the privilege of a powerful connection. What happens to the people who don't have that? I've been in advocacy long enough to know the statistics. I've seen the reports showing how travelers of color, especially Black women, are disproportionately pulled aside for extra screening. But reading numbers in a report is not the same as feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on you while you unpack your life in public. It's one thing to talk about bias in meetings and conferences. It's another to have it spit in your face while you're just trying to get to work. I thought about that child in the TSA line, asking their mother why I was in trouble. What lesson did they take away from watching a uniformed officer single me out? What message was planted in their mind about who belongs and who doesn't? Those questions stay with you. They follow you into every airport, every boarding gate, every hotel lobby. When I landed, I found a flood of messages still coming in. Stories from strangers who had never spoken about their own experiences because they thought no one would believe them. I read every single one. I've been traveling for work for 20 years. Still, I get pulled aside more than my white colleagues. They said my ticket was suspicious, even though my company booked it. I missed my flight because of them. My teenage son was stopped and asked if he was really the passenger on his boarding pass. These weren't isolated events. They were proof of a system that normalizes suspicion based on skin color, then hides behind procedure when questioned. I knew then that my response couldn't end at personal vindication. It had to be about pushing change that would outlast me. That's when I decided to partner my nonprofit with my husband's airline group to create a public traveler rights campaign. Visible at every contracted checkpoint, in every premium and general boarding area we had influence over. We'd make sure every passenger knew their rights. We'd make sure every security partner knew they'd be held accountable when those rights were ignored. It wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it would make silence harder to maintain. And that's how change begins. As the plane touched down, I felt something shift. Not relief. I don't think I'll ever feel fully safe in these spaces, but a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just the woman who called her husband to fix a bad situation. I was the woman who would make sure no one else had to make that call in the first place. And I was just getting started. The next time I walked into an airport, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. Same woman, same bag, same seat assignment in first class. But I carried something else now. The knowledge that the line between respect and humiliation was thinner than most people want to believe. It wasn't the officer's voice I remembered most. It was the silence that followed his words. The way a crowd will stand still and watch, but not step in. It was the unspoken understanding that, in his eyes, I was an intruder in a space my ticket had already paid for. That's the part I'll never let go of. Because the truth is, what happened to me is happening somewhere else right now. Maybe to a young woman heading to her first big interview. Maybe to a grandmother visiting her grandchildren. And if no one speaks up, it will happen again tomorrow, and the day after. That's why the changes we made through my nonprofit and my husband's airline group matter. Not because they erase what happened, but because they make it harder for someone like that officer to act with impunity. Every sign posted, every training conducted, every review logged is a reminder that the passenger in front of you is more than a stereotype to be judged. I wish I could say that's enough. But real change isn't measured in one airport's policies. It's measured in the moment when an officer looks at a passenger and decides not to reach for suspicion as their first reaction. Until that's the norm, I'll keep telling this story. And I'll keep fighting for the people who can't make the call that changes the room. I didn't set out that morning looking for a confrontation. But I'm glad I didn't walk away quietly. He thought he was keeping me out of a line. What he didn't know was that I helped write the rules for the whole journey. Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong somewhere? Not because of what you did, but because of who you are. I want to hear your story. If you believe respect should never depend on skin color, subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ and join the community that refuses to be silent. Share this video so the next person who's singled out knows they're not alone. Because silence protects no one, but stories like ours can change everything.